Lady Charlotte Fairburn knew she shouldn't leave the ballroom alone, much less seek refuge in the Middleton Mansion's library. But the combination of her growing impatience with the predictable conversations of gentlemen and the silent promise of a tranquil environment made the temptation irresistible. With light, quick steps, she crossed the corridors and pushed open the heavy mahogany door. The air inside was different, a mix of aged wood and the leather of the books, a safe haven for her restless mind. Charlotte let out a relieved sigh as her fingers traced the spines lined neatly on the shelves, as if greeting old friends. However, her peace was short-lived. The discreet sound of a click made her heart leap. She turned, alarmed, to find a tall, unmistakable figure standing by the door. Rowan Hawthorne, the Duke of Blackmore, with his slightly tousled brown hair and a gaze that seemed to pierce through layers of thought, stood there watching her as if he owned the place, or her intentions. Books have always attracted dangerous minds, but I must admit, I didn't expect to find Lady Fairburn in this library, alone and unarmed. Charlotte lifted her chin, masking her surprise with a defiant expression. Am I to understand that your grace now patrols libraries, or do you simply delight in interrupting innocent ladies in search of some solace? The Duke raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth curving into an ironic smile. He took a few steps forward, his imposing presence enhanced by the ease with which he carried the weight of his title. Interrupt? Number observe? Perhaps. It's always fascinating to see who abandons the social theater in favor of seeking a little truth among the pages. Or perhaps it's simply more convenient for your grace to leave the ballroom when you're not being courted by all the ladies of the season, Charlotte countered, turning back to face the bookshelf, determined not to show the effect his presence had on her. Perhaps, Rowan replied, his voice lower, almost a murmur. Or perhaps I prefer the company of a lady who knows what she wants. Charlotte spun around sharply, narrowing her eyes. And you believe you know what I want, Your Grace? He observed her for a long moment before responding, as if deciding how much to reveal. I believe you want something you can't find in that ballroom, something those foolish gentlemen could never offer. Charlotte felt a pang of irritation and discomfort. He was arrogant, no doubt, but there was something in his words that struck a nerve. She crossed her arms and took a step closer, enough for their gazes to lock directly. And what makes you think you can offer anything beyond empty provocations and ill-founded judgments? Rowan smiled, a smile that seemed to hold more secrets than she could bear. Perhaps I can't, but I suspect that between the two of us, I'm the only one willing to admit I'm not interested in what others think. Silence fell between them, heavy with tension and something Charlotte couldn't quite name. She should leave, return to the ballroom, and leave this intriguing, dangerous man behind. But her feet stayed firmly in place. Unless, of course, he continued, leaning slightly closer, you'd rather I leave. In that case, all you have to do is ask. Charlotte didn't reply immediately. Instead, she turned back to the bookshelf, scanning the titles with her eyes. If you're so inclined to offer something useful, Your Grace, tell me, which of these books might make this evening less tedious? His low laugh filled the room, and Charlotte felt her cheeks warm, though she wasn't sure if it was from anger or something else. A literary challenge, then? Rowan said. Very well, but only if you promise to read it to the end. When he handed her an old volume, their hands brushed briefly, and Charlotte felt a shiver run down her spine. She gripped the book firmly and looked up at him, determined to regain control. I keep my promises, Duke of Blackmore, provided you keep yours. He smiled again, but this time there was something gentler in the gesture. Consider it a commitment, Lady Fairburn. With those words, he turned and left, leaving Charlotte alone with the book and a head full of questions she knew she shouldn't be asking. Lady Charlotte Fairburn tried to maintain her composure as she crossed the ballroom, the old leather-bound book still in her hands. The library, with its air of safety and mystery, now felt like a distant dream. She could still feel the tension from her conversation with the Duke of Blackmore, Rowan Hawthorne, pressing against her chest, but she knew she had to push the memory aside. The last thing she wanted was to attract curious glances, or worse, the whispers of vigilant matrons hunting for scandals like trophies. "Charlotte!" called Lydia Whittemore, her best friend, waving from a chair near the buffet. "Where have you been?" "Don't tell me you found something more exciting than this masterpiece of the season." Lydia gestured dramatically at the room full of dancers and young gentlemen trying to appear charming. Charlotte forced a smile and sat down beside Lydia. "I just needed a moment of silence away from all this. And did you find anything interesting?" Lydia leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Just books." Charlotte shrugged, hoping her answer would end the conversation. But before she could change the subject, an unmistakable presence entered the ballroom. Rowan, the Duke of Blackmore, with his casual stride and crooked smile, seemed entirely unbothered by the social rules dictating discretion for a late arrival. He paused briefly to greet a few acquaintances, but his eyes inevitably landed on Charlotte. She froze, feeling her cheeks flush. Rowan didn't smile, but the glint in his eyes said it all. He knew she was uncomfortable, and he seemed to take amusement in it. "Oh heavens!" Lydia exclaimed, following Charlotte's gaze. "Don't tell me the Duke has taken over your thoughts tonight?" Charlotte spun toward Lydia, nearly knocking over her friend's glass of lemonade. "Of course not." Lydia raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Well, if he has, I recommend caution. The Duke of Blackmore can be charming, but he's as reliable as a promise of good weather in London." Charlotte muttered something unintelligible, but her attention drifted back to Rowan, now surrounded by a small group of young, exuberant ladies. Despite the distance, he seemed aware of her every move, as though he could sense her presence without looking directly at her. "Charlotte," Lydia called again, her tone now tinged with concern. "Did he say something to you? You look distracted." "It's nothing, just fatigue," Charlotte lied, trying to mask the turmoil within her. But the evening wasn't about to let her off so easily. During a dance, as Charlotte tried to focus on the graceful steps of the quadrille, she felt a gaze so intense it made her falter slightly. When she looked up, she saw Rowan leaning casually against one of the ballroom columns, watching her with an enigmatic smile. She pressed her lips together, determined to ignore him, but every time their eyes met, a wave of nervous energy coursed through her. What did he want? Was he following her? Or was this simply a game played by a sharp, manipulative mind she suspected he possessed? "Lady Fairburn, are you well?" asked her dance partner, a young viscount whose concern seemed genuine in the face of her sudden silence. "Yes, my lord, I just lost my rhythm," she replied with a quick smile, though the unease lingered. When the music ended, Charlotte curtsied and slipped away to a corner of the ballroom. She needed air, space, anything, but that was impossible amidst the crowd of guests around her. Before she could decide her next move, a low voice sounded beside her. "Are you avoiding me, Lady Fairburn?" She turned to find Rowan standing there, casually leaning against the wall, close enough that the scent of cedar and brandy seemed to surround her. "Avoiding you?" Charlotte crossed her arms, lifting her chin. "You overestimate yourself." "Ah, perhaps." Rowan shrugged, his smile unshaken. "Or perhaps I'm trying to understand why the confident woman I saw in the library seems so anxious now." Charlotte felt anger rise, a reflexive response. "And why should that concern you, my lord?" He leaned in slightly, as if to ensure no one else could overhear. "Because, Lady Fairburn, I have the distinct impression that there's far more to you than others realize." For a moment, Charlotte was at a loss for words, not because it was a compliment, but because he sounded sincere, a rare quality in a man she suspected of being a master manipulator. "Perhaps you should focus your observations on someone else, Your Grace. I'm certain many ladies would welcome your attention." "Perhaps," he replied, his tone light again, but with a glimmer of something deeper. "But they're not you." Charlotte blinked, caught off guard. Before she could form a response, Rowan stepped away, leaving her alone in the corner of the ballroom with more questions than answers and an unease she couldn't quite shake. That night, as she rode home in her family's carriage, Charlotte clutched the book Rowan had given her to her lap, as if it might hold answers the man himself refused to provide. She knew she should ignore him, treat him like any other libertine who enjoyed provoking ladies for his own amusement. But there was something about Rowan Hawthorne, something dangerously difficult to dismiss. Lady Charlotte Fairburn spent the following morning trying to banish thoughts of the Duke of Blackmore from her mind. She sat by her bedroom window, the book he had given her the night before open on her lap. But the words refused to make sense. There was something about the way he had looked at her, something more than mere interest or provocation. He seemed to see her in a way no one ever had. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. It was Lydia, bursting into the room with the energy of a storm, carrying a folded newspaper and a worried expression. "Have you seen this?" Lydia asked, handing the paper to Charlotte. Charlotte took it, and her eyes widened at the headline. "Duke of Blackmore and a mysterious lady. What happened in the library?" The article was vague, but it insinuated that Rowan had been seen leaving the library with an unidentified woman, spurring the gossips of society to uncover her identity. "This is ridiculous," Charlotte exclaimed, her cheeks flushing with heat. "Ridiculous or not, you know how these rumors work." Lydia sat on the edge of the bed. "If anyone finds out you were in the library that night, your reputation might not survive the season." Charlotte closed the newspaper with a sigh, the weight of the situation pressing on her. She needed to avoid Rowan, to erase any connection between them, but something told her it wouldn't be so simple. Later that afternoon, while walking in the gardens to clear her mind, Charlotte heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Rowan, impeccably dressed but lacking his usual air of arrogance. "Your Grace, this is highly improper." Charlotte crossed her arms, trying to appear resolute. "I cannot be seen speaking with you." "I know." Rowan raised his hands as if asking for peace. "But I needed to speak with you." Charlotte hesitated. There was something about the way he spoke that disarmed her, even as her reason screamed that she should ignore him. "Make it quick, then." Rowan stepped closer, his eyes fixed on hers. "The article in the paper, that wasn't an accident." "What do you mean?" Charlotte frowned, suspicion flickering across her face. "I believe someone is trying to incriminate me," he explained, his voice low and urgent. "Someone who wouldn't hesitate to ruin your reputation as well if it suits their purposes." Charlotte stepped back, his words igniting a storm of fear and anger within her. "And why would anyone do that?" Rowan took a deep breath, as if weighing his words carefully. "Because there are secrets certain people would rather keep buried, secrets involving our families." The ground seemed to shift beneath Charlotte's feet. "What are you saying, Your Grace?" "I'm saying that your father's death wasn't an accident." She froze. The memory of her father was an old wound, but she had never considered the possibility that something other than a tragic accident had claimed his life. "How do you know this?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Because I lost someone too." Rowan's voice grew heavier, tinged with something resembling pain. "My father. And the circumstances were similar." Charlotte felt a mix of shock and disbelief. He seemed sincere, but how could she trust him? Rowan was known for being manipulative and reserved, yet there was something in his eyes that felt real, something she couldn't ignore. "And what do you expect me to do with this information?" she asked, crossing her arms to hide the tremor in her hands. "I expect you to help me uncover the truth." Rowan took another step forward, so close now that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "Because, Lady Fairburn, if we don't face this together, I fear we'll both end up ensnared in the same traps that claimed our parents." Charlotte looked at him, torn between the urge to send him away and the desperate need to know more. What he was saying made sense, but it could just as easily be a ploy. If what you're saying is true, then you'll have to prove it. I'm not foolish enough to follow your plans without something concrete." Rowan smiled faintly, as if he had expected exactly this response. "And that's why I chose you, Lady Fairburn. Because I know you're the only one with the courage to face what's coming." Charlotte stayed silent as he turned and walked away, disappearing down the path that led back to the street. His words left her shaken, but they also planted a seed of curiosity she knew she couldn't ignore. That night, Charlotte lay awake for hours, the book forgotten on her desk, as she tried to process what had happened. The idea that her father might have been the victim of something more sinister consumed her thoughts. But what troubled her most was the realization that, whether she liked it or not, the Duke of Blackmore was now a central figure in her life. And that terrified her as much as it intrigued her. The days following her encounter with Rowan were chaos in Charlotte's mind. His words, laced with dangerous implications, echoed in her thoughts like a melody she couldn't silence. The Duke of Blackmore had hinted that her father's death wasn't accidental, but so far he had offered no concrete evidence. Charlotte wanted to dismiss him as an opportunist, but there was something in his eyes when he spoke, a deep, genuine pain that made it difficult to doubt his sincerity. That evening, a dinner at the Bellamy mansion promised to be a chance for Charlotte to reclaim her standing in society. Lydia had assured her it was the perfect opportunity to quash the rumors stemming from the Middletons' ball. But Charlotte knew it would be hard to ignore the weight of unanswered questions, especially since Rowan would also be in attendance. As soon as she arrived, Charlotte spotted Rowan engaged in lively conversation with a group of gentlemen. He was impeccably dressed, his posture relaxed as though the room were his domain. But she noticed the tension behind his smile. It was the same tension he had carried since the start of this dangerous game. "Don't go talk to him," Lydia whispered beside her, interrupting her thoughts. "He's dragged you into enough scandal already." "He hasn't dragged me into anything," Charlotte replied, adjusting the hem of her dress. "But I'm beginning to think he's more dangerous than he appears." "Exactly my point." Lydia gave her a tight smile. "He's a trap disguised as an invitation. Be careful, Charlotte." Despite her friend's warnings, Charlotte knew she needed to confront Rowan again. It wasn't just about clearing her name, she needed answers, and he seemed to be the only one willing to provide them. During dinner, the conversations flowed as usual, full of formalities and whispered scandals over glasses of wine. Charlotte found herself seated next to a young baronet who droned on incessantly about his latest fox hunt. She nodded mechanically, her thoughts fixed on the man across the table. Rowan appeared perfectly at ease, but Charlotte could see how carefully he observed the room. He wasn't just a libertine masquerading as a gentleman. He was a strategist, someone who played on the weaknesses of others. Charlotte couldn't decide whether she was impressed or terrified by this realization. When dinner ended, the guests were guided to the music room. Taking advantage of the commotion, Rowan approached Charlotte, who tried to avoid meeting his gaze. "I'd like to speak with you," he murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "I see no need," she replied, maintaining a polite smile as Lydia tugged her toward a corner. Rowan raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Perhaps you don't now, but I believe you'll change your mind before the night is over." Before she could respond, he vanished into the crowd. Charlotte tried to dismiss the shiver that ran down her spine, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was a pawn in a game she barely understood. Later, as music filled the hall, Charlotte found Rowan alone in the Bellamy library, leaning against a desk as if he had been waiting for her. "Lady Fairburn," he began, with a smile that felt calculated. "What a coincidence to find you here again." Charlotte closed the door behind her, crossing her arms. "Don't treat me like a fool, Duke of Blackmore. I know this isn't a coincidence." At last, a bit of honesty. He straightened slightly but kept a respectful distance. "So, are you ready to hear the truth? Or would you rather keep playing games? If you have something of value to say it now. I have no patience for riddles." Rowan leaned in slightly, his expression growing serious. There are records of dealings between our families, old agreements that shouldn't have ended in tragic deaths. Your father knew something that made him dangerous, just as mine did. Charlotte raised an eyebrow, skeptical. That's pure speculation, Your Grace. I see no proof. He pulled a small envelope from his pocket and handed it to her. Charlotte hesitated before opening it. Inside was a letter in her father's handwriting, referencing a debt of honor linked to the Hawthorne family and another name she didn't recognize. Montgomery. Montgomery? She asked, looking up at Rowan. A powerful man, but discreet. He controls far more than he appears to, and I believe he's behind all of this. Charlotte felt the weight of his words, but still wasn't sure if she could trust him. And what do you expect me to do with this? I expect you to help me uncover the truth. Rowan stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. I can't do this alone, Lady Fairburn. And honestly, I don't think you can either. Charlotte stood silent for a moment, feeling the gravity of the situation. She knew she was stepping into something far bigger than she'd imagined, but she also knew she couldn't turn back. Very well, she said finally. But know this. If you're lying, I'll do whatever it takes to expose you. Rowan smiled, but this time there was a hint of relief in his expression. That's exactly why I chose you. As he left the room, Charlotte glanced at the letter again. The name Montgomery stood out in her mind like a warning sign, and she knew that from this moment on, her life would never be the same. Charlotte spotted him at the edge of the ballroom, dressed in black and silver, a mask covering half his face but failing to obscure the unmistakable gleam in his eyes. Lady Fairburn, as always, stunning, Rowan said, bowing with exaggerated flair as he approached. Duke of Blackmore, as always, pretentious, Charlotte replied coolly, though the corner of her mouth betrayed a reluctant smile. Well, if we're going to trade barbs, perhaps we should do so somewhere more private. He offered her his arm. Charlotte hesitated for a moment, but curiosity won out. Taking his arm, she followed him down a side corridor that led to a dimly lit gallery, where the voices and music from the ballroom were muffled. I hope you didn't drag me here just to compliment my gown, she said, crossing her arms. Actually, I brought you here to discuss something far more interesting, Rowan replied, leaning in slightly, his voice low and conspiratorial. Montgomery will be here tonight. Charlotte's heart raced. Montgomery? Are you certain? Absolutely. Rowan paused, his gaze steady on hers. He enjoys events like this, where he can observe without drawing attention. What do you suggest we do? She asked, fighting to maintain her composure. I'll follow him, Rowan said, as though it were obvious. Meanwhile, you can work the room. Someone here knows more than they're letting on. Charlotte frowned. And if this is all a trap? Then it's a trap for both of us. Rowan shrugged, but there was a determination in his voice that made her feel oddly reassured. They returned to the ballroom, but Charlotte couldn't shake her unease. As she danced with a young baronet, her eyes scanned the crowd for any sign of a man who might be Montgomery. Every masked face seemed to conceal a secret. Every laugh carried an undertone of hidden intentions. When Rowan reappeared at her side, she could tell something was happening. He leaned in to whisper in her ear, drawing curious glances from her dance partner. I've found him. He's on the balcony. A chill ran through Charlotte. The evening had taken a far more dangerous turn than she had anticipated. What do we do now? She asked, trying to suppress the growing unease in her chest. Now we play along, Rowan said, offering a reassuring smile. But there was something in his eyes that betrayed his own apprehension. Together, they made their way to the balcony. Montgomery stood there, dressed in dark attire, a golden mask covering his entire face. He appeared to be engaged in conversation with another gentleman, but as Rowan and Charlotte approached, his posture shifted. Duke of Blackmore, how rare to see you venture out of your solitude. Montgomery said, his voice cold and calculated as though he already anticipated their motives. "And how rare to meet someone who doesn't relish anonymity at a masquerade ball," Rowan replied, his tone equally sharp. Montgomery chuckled, but the sound held no warmth. His attention turned to Charlotte, and she felt his gaze like a blade. There was something deeply unsettling about him, something that made her skin crawl. "And who is this enchanting lady accompanying you?" Montgomery asked, his voice smooth but laced with menace. Charlotte met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "Someone who knows how to ask the right questions," she said evenly. Montgomery's smile faded. "The right questions can be dangerous, my dear. Be careful not to harm yourself." With that, he turned and strode back into the ballroom, disappearing into the crowd. The tension lingered in the air as Rowan placed a hand on Charlotte's arm, stopping her from following. "He knows we're investigating," Rowan said, his voice low and urgent. Charlotte nodded, still processing the encounter. Montgomery's presence had been as oppressive as his words. He knew something that could change everything, and Charlotte was more determined than ever to uncover the truth, even if it meant facing dangers she had never imagined. Charlotte couldn't sleep. The masquerade ball lingered in her mind like a storm on the verge of breaking. The figure of Montgomery, with his golden mask and cutting words, had planted a fear she couldn't ignore. Every step he took seemed laden with intention, every glance a veiled threat. She needed answers. The next morning, the Duke of Blackmore appeared at the Fairburn estate as if summoned by her thoughts. The butler announced his arrival with hesitation, clearly aware that Rowan was the last person Charlotte wished to see so early in the day. "He is waiting in the garden, milady," the butler informed her. Charlotte sighed, straightening the simple dress she wore, unwilling to change for the occasion. When she found Rowan among the rose bushes, he looked more serious than ever, a foreboding sign. "Have you come to announce another impending catastrophe, Duke of Blackmore?" Charlotte asked, crossing her arms. Rowan didn't smile. "Montgomery knows we're investigating, which means he knows exactly where to aim." Charlotte hesitated, feeling the weight of his words. "Do you think he would act against us?" "I don't think, Charlotte. I know." He handed her a sheet of paper, marked with refined handwriting. The message was simple yet threatening. "The curious have short lives." Charlotte felt a chill. "He sent this to you?" "No, it was left on my desk this morning," Rowan said, his tone calm, though she could sense his unease. "He's warning us." She looked at him, searching his eyes for answers. "Then why continue? Why not walk away before it's too late?" Rowan stepped closer, his gaze burning with intensity. "Because if we walk away, he wins. He destroyed our parents, Charlotte. Do you really want to let him keep destroying lives?" A surge of anger mingled with her fear. She knew Rowan was right, but that didn't make the decision any easier. "Then what do you propose?" "A meeting," Rowan said, leaning in, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Montgomery needs to believe we're willing to negotiate. It'll give us a chance to learn more about him." "And if it's a trap?" Charlotte asked, her voice firmer than she felt. "Then we make sure the trap is for him, not us." That night, under a blanket of stars, Charlotte and Rowan waited in the Ashcroft garden, the chosen site for the meeting. The tension was palpable, and every sound seemed amplified. Charlotte wore a deep blue gown, the fabric flowing around her legs like water. Rowan, standing beside her, looked more serious than she had ever seen him. "Will he come?" Charlotte whispered, trying to mask her nerves. "He'll come. Montgomery never misses an opportunity to assert his control." When they finally heard footsteps, Charlotte instinctively grabbed Rowan's arm. Montgomery emerged from the shadows, unmasked this time, but still radiating danger. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, and his eyes gleamed as if he had already won a chess match they hadn't started. "So, the young heirs have decided to confront the wolf?" Montgomery said, a smile on his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "We came to talk," Rowan replied, his voice steady. No need for unnecessary conflict. Montgomery chuckled, the sound sharp and empty. You might call this a conversation, but we both know it isn't. Charlotte stepped forward, surprising herself with her boldness. Why did you kill our parents? What did they do to deserve it? Montgomery studied her, his gaze as sharp as a blade. They asked questions, just as you're doing now. What kind of questions? Rowan asked, his fists clenched, tension rippling through his frame. Questions about money, power, and justice, things that don't concern children like you. Montgomery shrugged, as if it were all a trivial game. Charlotte felt anger bubbling within her. If you think you can intimidate us, you're mistaken. Montgomery laughed again, a hollow sound. Oh, my dear, I don't need to intimidate. You're already caught in the game, and the only way out is to lose. Before Rowan could respond, Montgomery turned and began to walk away. A word of advice, children. Quit while you still have something to lose. As he disappeared into the night, Charlotte and Rowan remained rooted in place, his words echoing between them. Is he bluffing? Charlotte asked, her gaze fixed on Rowan. I don't know, Rowan admitted, his worry evident. But we have to find out. Charlotte nodded, her resolve hardening. Montgomery would not scare them away, not while they still had the strength to fight. And as the stars illuminated the silent garden, Charlotte knew the battle was far from over. The morning after their encounter with Montgomery brought a gray sky that mirrored the weight of what Charlotte and Rowan were up against. Montgomery's threat loomed over them like an impending storm. Charlotte knew they were treading dangerous ground, but her resolve to uncover the truth about her father and about Rowan, a man who intrigued and exasperated her in equal measure, kept her steady. This has to end soon, she said, finding Rowan in the Hawthorne Estates library that afternoon. He was seated in a leather armchair, his gaze fixed on a map spread across the table, though his distant expression suggested his mind was elsewhere. I agree. Rowan's eyes met hers, and Charlotte noticed something different in his expression. More serious, perhaps even worried. We have to confront him. Now. Charlotte took the chair opposite him, her brow furrowed. And what exactly do you plan to do, Duke of Blackmore? Point a finger and accuse him without evidence? That would only give Montgomery what he wants, a reason to silence us. Rowan shook his head slowly, as though still calculating his next move. It's not that simple. But we can't wait for him to undo himself. Montgomery doesn't play fair. Before Charlotte could respond, the butler entered with a sealed envelope. Rowan took the letter and read it quickly, his brows lifting in surprise. What is it? Charlotte asked, leaning in to glimpse the contents. An invitation. Rowan held up the paper, showing the Montgomery family crest in wax. He wants to see us tonight. Charlotte's stomach churned. It's a trap. Certainly. Rowan set the letter on the table, his expression hardening. But if we want answers, we have to take the risk. That evening, the meeting was set to take place at Montgomery's opulent estate, a mansion notorious for its almost oppressive grandeur. When Charlotte arrived with Rowan, the main hall was already filled with masked guests. The invitation had mentioned a masquerade theme, something Montgomery clearly favored, which only heightened the unsettling atmosphere. Charlotte adjusted the silver mask over her eyes, feeling like a pawn in a game she still didn't fully understand. Beside her, Rowan was impeccable in black, his mask leaving only his intense eyes visible. Stay close to me, he whispered as they entered the hall. We don't know what to expect. I don't usually lose my way, Duke of Blackmore, Charlotte replied, more to mask her own anxiety than to tease him. Montgomery appeared like a shadow amidst the crowd, moving with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. He exchanged pleasantries with a few guests before finally approaching Charlotte and Rowan. What an honor to have you here tonight, he said, his smile as false as the glimmering chandeliers above. I trust you're enjoying the atmosphere. Charlotte kept her tone cool, refusing to let her nerves show. Your hospitality is as intriguing as your intentions, Lord Montgomery. Montgomery laughed, a sharp, empty sound. Ever the witty Lady Fairburn. It's a shame you've involved yourself in matters that don't concern you. Perhaps they concern me more than you realize, Charlotte said, lifting her chin in defiance. Oh, I realize all too well. Montgomery turned to Rowan, ignoring Charlotte for a moment. And you, Blackmore? Are you as willing to risk everything as you appear? Rowan stepped forward, his voice like steel. More than you think, Montgomery. For a moment, Montgomery didn't reply. He looked at them both with a mix of disdain and fascination, as though calculating his next move. Then let's play. He gestured to a servant who brought over a tray of wine glasses. A toast to the game you insist on playing, even knowing you've already lost. Charlotte took a glass but didn't drink. Her mind raced, searching for any clues in Montgomery's behavior. He was so confident, so at ease. There had to be more beneath the surface. Suddenly, a man dressed in gray appeared beside Montgomery and handed him a slip of paper. Montgomery read it quickly, and something in his expression shifted. It was subtle, a faint tightening of his jaw, a flicker in his eyes. But Charlotte noticed. "Is something the matter, my lord?" she asked, her smile sharp. Montgomery slipped the paper into his pocket, his composure returning. "Nothing that should concern you, my dear." But Charlotte knew he was lying. She glanced at Rowan, and he seemed to understand immediately. Something was happening, something Montgomery didn't want them to know. When Montgomery drifted away to mingle with other guests, Charlotte and Rowan seized the opportunity. "He received a message," Charlotte whispered, "and he didn't like what it said." "We need to find out what it was," Rowan said, taking her hand and leading her to a quieter corner. "And we need to do it now." Charlotte hesitated, but she knew he was right. They were too close to the truth to back down now. The rest of the evening became a blur of whispers, glances, and quick movements. Rowan managed to intercept one of Montgomery's servants and obtained a copy of the note. It was a simple but damning message. "The secret won't stay buried forever." Charlotte's heart raced as she read the words. Montgomery wasn't untouchable after all. If someone was bold enough to challenge him, perhaps there was hope for them too. "This changes everything," Rowan said, his eyes gleaming with a mix of determination and hope. "But it also puts us in more danger." Charlotte pressed the note to her chest, trying to absorb the weight of what it meant. "Charlotte, we're closer than ever. We can't stop now." She looked at him, seeing the same intensity that had drawn her to him from the start. Rowan was more than an ally. He was the only person she could trust in that moment. "Then let's finish this," she said, her voice steady. And as the lights in the hall began to dim, Charlotte knew the final battle was about to begin. If you love stories full of twists and unexpected emotions, imagine this scenario. A young marquis, desperate to save his estate, hires a penniless lady as a governess for his younger sister. But what starts as a practical arrangement quickly becomes complicated when family secrets come to light, threatening to destroy everything he's worked to protect. Curious to find out how a simple agreement can turn into chaos? Then you'll love the video. A duke pays a widow to have an heir, but the birth of the children leaves him in shock. It's a plot full of surprises, intrigue, and of course, that touch of romance that warms the heart. If you enjoy lighthearted and fun love stories, subscribe to the channel and give it a like to keep following amazing plots like this. Comment on the video. Secrets transform everything into new possibilities. And don't forget to check out the links in the first pinned comment, where I've shared books I've read and loved, all set in the fascinating Regency era. They're perfect for anyone looking to dive into stories full of charm and elegance.